23 children, 3 months, all of them gone without a trace. The official record said they'd been adopted by generous benefactors into loving homes. But the truth, hidden beneath the floorboards of a Manchester orphanage, would reveal something far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Manchester, 1882. The industrial heart of England was a city of stark contrasts. Grand Victorian mansions overlooked smoke-choked factories where children as young as 5 labored 16 hours a day. In the narrow streets of the slums, families crowded into single rooms, and disease spread like wildfire through tenements that never saw sunlight. Cholera, typhoid, and consumption claimed thousands of lives every year, leaving behind orphans by the hundreds. For these children, there were few options. The workhouse meant brutal labor and cruel punishment. The streets meant starvation, prostitution, or worse. But there was supposedly a third option, a better option, the Bright Hope Orphanage. Bright Hope stood on the edge of the city's wealthy quarter, an imposing 3-story building of dark brick and iron gates. It had been established 15 years earlier by a consortium of Manchester's most respected citizens, factory owners, merchants, members of parliament. The orphanage was their philanthropic pride, proof that the wealthy cared about the city's unfortunate children. Unlike the overcrowded, filthy institutions that warehoused the poor, Bright Hope was clean, well-staffed, and selective. Only the most promising orphans were accepted, children who showed intelligence, good health, and proper behavior. The orphanage's literature promised that these children would receive education, moral instruction, and most importantly, the opportunity for adoption into good families. And the adoptions happened regularly. Every few weeks, well-dressed couples would arrive in elegant carriages. The orphanage director, a stern woman named Mrs. Pemberton, would present carefully selected children. Money would change hands. Substantial donations to support the orphanage's noble work, of course. Papers would be signed, though curiously, these papers were never filed with any public authority. And the children would leave, presumably to begin new lives in comfortable homes far from Manchester's grime and poverty. No one questioned this arrangement. Why would they? The benefactors were respectable people. Mrs. Pemberton had letters of commendation from bishops and members of parliament. The children who remained at Bright Hope seemed healthy and well cared for. It was a system that worked perfectly for everyone involved, a shining example of Victorian charity and social responsibility. Until Eleanor Ashford arrived in March of 1882. Miss Ashford was 26 years old, educated at a ladies' seminary, and recently orphaned herself after her father's business failure and subsequent death. She needed employment, and the position of governess at Bright Hope seemed ideal. She would teach the older children reading, writing, arithmetic, and deportment. The salary was modest but sufficient, and the work was respectable. When she presented herself at the orphanage's front door that cold March morning, she had no idea she was walking into a nightmare. Her first week passed normally enough. The children seemed obedient and quiet, perhaps unnaturally so. There were about 40 of them at any given time, aged from 3 to 14. They wore matching gray uniforms, ate simple but adequate meals, and attended lessons in a drafty classroom. Eleanor noticed that the younger children seemed fearful, jumping at sudden noises, speaking only when spoken to. She attributed this to the institutional environment. Orphanages were not known for warmth and affection. But then she noticed the disappearances. A girl named Sarah, perhaps 9 years old with auburn hair and a quick mind for mathematics, was simply gone one morning. When Eleanor asked about her, Mrs. Pemberton smiled coldly and said Sarah had been adopted by a wonderful family in Scotland. How fortunate for the child. 2 days later, twin boys disappeared. Another adoption. 3 days after that, a teenage girl vanished. Eleanor began to feel uneasy. The adoptions were happening too frequently, and there was something strange about the process. No adoption agency visited the orphanage. No prospective parents came during the day to meet the children. The benefactors only arrived at night, after the younger children were in bed. Eleanor started paying closer attention. She noticed that Mrs. Pemberton kept a leather-bound ledger locked in her office desk, and that she became agitated whenever anyone asked about specific children who had left. She noticed that the older children, the ones who had been at Bright Hope for years, never spoke about those who were adopted. There was no cheerful gossip about former friends who had gone to better lives. Instead, there was silence. Heavy, fearful silence. One evening in late April, Eleanor was working late in the classroom, preparing lessons for the next day. The building was quiet. The children were asleep. Mrs. Pemberton had gone home to her own residence nearby, and only one elderly caretaker remained on the ground floor. Eleanor needed fresh chalk from the supply closet in the basement. She took a candle and made her way down the narrow stone staircase. The basement was cold and damp, a maze of storage rooms and coal cellars. Eleanor found the supply closet and was gathering chalk when she heard something. A faint creaking sound, like old wood settling. It came from deeper in the basement, from a section she had never explored. Curiosity overcame caution. Holding her candle high, she followed the sound. At the back of the basement, behind stacks of broken furniture and old crates, she found a heavy wooden door secured with a padlock. The door was old, but the padlock was new, its brass surface still shiny. Eleanor knew she should turn back. This was clearly meant to be secure, off-limits. But the creaking sound came again from beyond that door. Setting down her candle, she searched the nearby storage area and found a rusted iron poker among old fireplace tools. It took several minutes of prying, but the screws holding the padlock's hasp finally pulled free from the rotting doorframe. The door swung open with a groan that echoed through the basement. Beyond was a small room, perhaps 10 feet square, with a low ceiling and no windows. The air that rushed out was thick and stale, carrying a sweet, sickly smell that made Eleanor's stomach turn. She retrieved her candle and stepped inside. The floor was covered in sawdust, but it didn't completely hide what lay beneath. Eleanor saw them immediately. Children's shoes. Dozens of them, small leather boots and worn slippers, arranged in rough rows. Between the shoes were other things. Locks of hair tied with ribbon, each one labeled with a name and date written on a paper tag. Small toys, rag dolls, wooden animals, a single tin soldier. And in the corner, half buried in the sawdust, a child's skeleton fingers still wrapped around a piece of cloth. Eleanor's candle fell from her trembling hand, but didn't go out. In its flickering light on the floor, she saw more. The walls were covered in scratches, dozens of them. Claw marks where small fingernails had scraped desperately at stone. And written in what looked like dried blood, over and over in childish letters. "Help us. Please help us. They're coming back." She should have screamed. She should have run. But Eleanor Ashford was her father's daughter, and he had taught her that courage meant acting even when terrified. She picked up the candle with shaking hands and forced herself to look more carefully. The shoes ranged in size from very small to adolescent. The hair samples numbered at least 30, maybe more. The dates on the tags went back years, the oldest from 1878. Some names she recognized from Mrs. Pemberton's casual mentions of adopted children. Sarah was there, the auburn-haired girl who had vanished just weeks ago. The twins, Matthew and Mark. Others she didn't know. Children who had passed through Bright Hope before Eleanor ever arrived. In the corner opposite the small bones, Eleanor found a wooden crate. Inside were documents. Letters, written in an educated hand, discussing shipments and deliveries. The language was coded, but the meaning became clear as Eleanor read. The orphanage was not facilitating adoptions. It was selling children. The benefactors, those respectable citizens who supposedly provided loving homes, were something else entirely. They were buyers in a market where orphans, children with no families to search for them, no records of their existence, were the commodity. But sold for what purpose? Eleanor found the answer in the last letters, the most recent correspondence. Some children went to factory owners who wanted workers too young and small to demand wages or rights. Others went to medical schools that needed bodies for anatomical study, but couldn't obtain enough cadavers legally. A few, the letters suggested with euphemistic language that barely concealed the horror, went to private individuals with what were delicately termed specialized interests. The prettiest girls, the most delicate boys. Eleanor's hands began to shake so violently she could barely hold the papers. A sound from above froze her in place. Footsteps on the basement stairs. Heavy footsteps, moving quickly. Someone had discovered the broken padlock. Eleanor shoved several of the most damning letters into her dress pocket and looked frantically for another exit. There was none. The room had a single door, and she could already hear someone approaching through the basement corridor. She blew out her candle and pressed herself against the wall beside the doorway, gripping the iron poker she had used to break the lock. The footsteps grew closer. A light appeared in the doorway. A man's voice, rough and impatient, called out. It was Silas Crowe, Mrs. Pemberton's assistant, a hulking man who supposedly managed the orphanage's physical maintenance and supplies. But Eleanor had noticed that he was always present when the benefactors visited at night, and that the children shrank away from him in terror. Crowe stepped into the room, holding a lantern high. Eleanor swung the poker with all her strength and caught him across the temple. He went down with a grunt of pain and surprise. Eleanor didn't wait. She ran, through the basement, up the stairs, her breath coming in terrified gasps. Behind her, she heard Crowe roaring in fury. She burst into the orphanage's entrance hall and nearly collided with the elderly caretaker. The old man stared at her in confusion, but Eleanor was already pulling him toward the front door, shouting that they needed the police immediately, that there had been a terrible crime. The caretaker, bewildered but responding to the urgency in her voice, helped her open the heavy door. They ran into the street. It was past midnight, the gas lamps creating pools of yellow light in the darkness. A constable on his rounds heard Eleanor's shouts and came running. She was nearly incoherent, words tumbling out about children and murder in a hidden room. The constable, a young man named Davies who took his duty seriously, didn't dismiss her as hysterical. Something in her face, the genuine terror and horror, convinced him. Within an hour, the police had secured the orphanage. Mrs. Pemberton was dragged from her bed, screaming about slander and false accusations. Silas Crowe, blood streaming from the wound on his head, tried to flee and was caught 2 streets away. And in the basement, detectives found the hidden room with its terrible contents. The investigation that followed shocked Manchester to its core. The ledger from Mrs. Pemberton's office, once the police forced it open, contained meticulous records. Over a period of 4 years, Bright Hope Orphanage had accepted 167 children. Of those, only 40 remained alive. The rest had been sold. Some to factories, yes, but most to worse fates. The benefactors were not the respectable citizens everyone believed. Some were genuine aristocrats and wealthy men, but others were procurers, middlemen in a network that trafficked children across England and even to the continent. The trials were sensational. Mrs. Pemberton and Silas Crowe were both hanged. 7 of the benefactors were arrested, though only 3 were convicted. The others had too much money and too many powerful connections. The scandal reached Parliament, and there were calls for reform in how orphanages were regulated and inspected. New laws were passed, though enforcement remained weak. The system that had enabled Bright Hope's horrors continued in modified form for decades. Eleanor Ashford became briefly famous, then infamous. Some praised her courage. Others condemned her for destroying the reputation of charitable work and making wild accusations against respectable men. She received threats. Her character was attacked in newspapers. Within a year, she had emigrated to America, unable to find employment in England. She never married, spent her life teaching in a Boston school for poor children, and died in 1923 at the age of 67. The Bright Hope Orphanage was closed and eventually demolished. The land was sold and a warehouse built on the site. But Manchester residents reported hearing children crying near that location for years afterward. Footsteps on stairs that no longer existed. Small voices calling for help in the darkness. Whether ghosts or guilty conscience, the echoes of Bright Hope refused to be silenced. Of the 127 children who disappeared from the orphanage, most were never found. A few were located in workhouses or factories and returned to public custody, though they were too traumatized to speak about their experiences. The majority simply vanished into Victorian England's dark underworld, absorbed into systems of exploitation that left no records and no traces. The case of Bright Hope Orphanage exposed an uncomfortable truth about Victorian society. This was an era that prided itself on progress, morality, and Christian values. The same people who attended church every Sunday and spoke eloquently about duty and virtue were often the ones who profited from others' suffering. Orphans, the poor, the vulnerable, they existed outside the circle of concern for many of the wealthy. They were not quite fully human in the eyes of those who saw themselves as society's rightful rulers. And here is the most disturbing question. How many other Bright Hopes were there? How many other institutions, in England and beyond, operated similar schemes? We know that child trafficking existed throughout the Victorian era. We know that children disappeared from workhouses and orphanages regularly. We know that some ended up in factories, brothels, traveling shows, medical experimentation, and worse. The Bright Hope case was unusual only because it was exposed. How many others never were? Eleanor Ashford's testimony at the trial included one detail that haunted everyone who heard it. When she found the hidden room in the basement, when she saw those small shoes and locks of hair arranged in rows, she said the most terrible thing wasn't the physical evidence. It was the writing on the walls. Help us. Please help us. They're coming back. Children who knew they were going to die, who left those desperate messages hoping someone would find them. And for years, no one did. They died in darkness, calling for help that never came. The Bright Hope Orphanage may be gone, but the systems that enabled it are not entirely vanquished. Even today, vulnerable children disappear into trafficking networks, into exploitation, into situations where they have no voice and no protection. The faces change, the methods evolve, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Some people view certain children as disposable, as commodities, as objects rather than human beings deserving of care and dignity. Victorian England built grand monuments to progress, but in the shadows of those monuments, behind the respectable facades of charitable institutions, horrors flourished. The children of Bright Hope paid the price for society's willingness to look away, to accept comfortable lies rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Their story is a reminder that respectability can be a mask, that institutions can be monsters, and that sometimes the only thing standing between justice and evil is one person willing to look beneath the floorboards. The truth, as always, is far darker than fiction. If you seek to understand the pulse of true horror, then like this story and subscribe to ensure you do not miss the next revelation. Tell me, what historical fear haunts your waking hours? And for the next case, look for the video on your screen.